I don't think I need to overly explain to you what the Fantastic Four is. It's one of the most important comic book series ever made, especially for Marvel Comics. It helped popularize writing superhero characters with a little bit more realism and honesty compared to everything else being produced before it. Ironically, the FF were closer to explorers and scientists from a pulp science fiction series than your traditional superheroes, even by today's standards. I won't go over the Fantastic Four's entire history, but I do believe it's important to speak about my personal history with the FF. When I started reading Marvel Comics, the FF were not my go-to. No, instead I was a much bigger fan of the X-Men, Spider-Man, and Thor. I could easily write about my past experiences with each of those comics, but I thought the Fantastic Four currently sits in an interesting space. As we all know, this summer we have the MCU releasing Fantastic Four First Steps, and we have DC releasing Superman Legacy. Notice how each brand, at least film-wise, are trying to go back to their historical roots. And that got me thinking about my roots with Marvel's roots. Okay, I think you get what I mean. I know the metaphor's a little clunky, but work with me here, alright? And my roots with the FF start with, in my opinion, the Four's best run. Fantastic Four by Mark Waid and Mike Wieringo. I know everyone also loves Johnathan Hickman's time on the Fantastic Four, and that run is great as well, but I full-heartedly will say that Waid and Wieringo's is the best. But hey, before we get any further, my analytics tell me that over 95% of my viewers are not subscribed. Look, I hate when YouTubers do this too, but maybe think about subscribing if you like my video, and maybe comment, share it, all sorts of other stuff, you know? But now that I've got that out of the way, let's go into some background history, okay? If you know anything about comics history, you know that the American comics industry wasn't doing too great in the late 90s. To explain to those who may not know, in the early 90s, the general public, as well as comic producers and distributors, took a major notice of the collector's market in comics. You see, there was a short period where people were genuinely selling their rare comic books and getting a decent pay for it. In fact, a lot of people still do it today. However, I'm betting you notice how I said rare comics. The people who were actually making some decent money off this stuff were selling comics from the golden age of the silver age of comics. You know, stuff that was actually rare. However, much of the comic industry decided to play into this collector's craze by basically flooding the market with many variants of comics. Why? Because people would want to collect all the variants and give a ton of money to the comic book companies. Except, you know, things that have high market value have high rarity. Thus, if you create a massive glut of product, supply goes up, demand goes down, and you lose money. And that's what put the industry in a bad place in the later 90s. It didn't help that due to this major issue, the quality of many comics went downhill. Not everything from this era had bad quality, there were still a ton of classics, but this was an era of event comic after event comic and a sense of utter desperation to hit their mainstream appeal again. And that's where we found the FF at this time. The comic wasn't in a great spot. Creative teams were slipping in and out, constantly shifting, and stories had very little consistency. The late 90s were a period of creative struggle with very little to show for it. But in the 2000s, it was starting to look a bit brighter. Marvel started getting back up, including starting up the Ultimate line, which in hindsight was a little controversial. Thus, the FF's editor at the time, Tom Brevoort, wanted to find the right team to bring out the strengths of the FF while also making them appeal to a modern age. And he got exactly what he paid for with Mark Waid and Mike Wieringo. If you know anything about Western comics history, you should probably know about Mark Waid. He's one of my favorite writers, probably of all time. He had some credits in the 80s, but most of his notable work start to show up in the 90s. The first major work he did was on The Flash in the 90s, and believe it or not, much of it was actually worked on with Mike Wieringo. But we'll get into his history in a bit. Mark Waid, after working on The Flash, would go on to work on the historic comic with Alex Ross, Kingdom Come. I don't think I need to tell you much on why this comic is just great. If you haven't read it, please do. Not only is it foundational, but it's phenomenal. Anyways, Mark Waid also did some work for Marvel in the 90s too. Most notably, working on the Age of Apocalypse era of the X-Men. And even in the 2000s, he's still having some great runs. Spider-Man, The Brave and the Bold, Superman Birthright, and so much more. He still writes great comics today, but if you were to ask me, one of his greatest works was his run on Fantastic Four that ran from 2002 to 2005. Mike Wieringo is one of my favorite comic artists of all time. He has this cartoonish and charming style that portrays the characters in a fun yet still honest light. He speaks on his own style, and I think he captures it the best. I just try to keep things fun. I like to do fun comics. It doesn't have to be realistic to be believable. In fact, sometimes I think that funny material might actually add something to certain books. He's worked for a ton of companies, and even some indie publishers too in his early career. But if you want me to recommend some of his best work, check out his work on The Flash, Fantastic Four, Telos, and Justice League Quarterly. But with all that background done with, I think it's time we get into the meat and potatoes of the video. Before I get heavily into the review section, I want to say here I'll structure this review as me speaking on the general arcs on this run in release order. I'll speak on the general lone issues here and there too, but there's really only like a few lone issues, so I'll most likely speak about them as related to the major arcs. Without further ado, let's talk about our first arc, Inside Out and 24 Blocks and 1 Blockhead. Wade in his first issue shows immediately that he gets the Fantastic Four. And that is that the Fantastic Four are a family and explorers first, and superheroes second. Specifically with his issue Inside Out, Wade uses this low-key, slice-of-life style introduction to bring us into the idea of what the Four are like. The premise of a marketer being brought in to basically punch up the Four's PR, but soon learn that they're perfect the way they are. Which is the sort of warm, sentimental thing that I attribute to the Fantastic Four. And we also build on this with 24 Blocks and 1 Blockhead. This is just a fun issue that exemplifies the relationship between Johnny and Ben, as well as his sister Sue. Johnny and Ben's relationship was always one of my favorite parts of the Fantastic Four, though this issue does have a slightly horrifying instance with Sue and Reed's daughter Valeria. We'll touch on that later because that's basically set up for an interesting arc. But anyways, these first two issues really exemplify to us why the Fantastic Four works and what you should really do when building these characters. And again, the art's just great. Mike Wieringo is just really good at being very expressive and really showing how these characters react. Now look, I don't know how to pronounce this sort of story arc's name at all. It just seems like a bunch of jumbled up mathematical nonsense. I mean, I can tell that there's the sigma sign and the pound sign and the pi sign, but it seems just like a bunch of gibberish. But that actually adds into the arc itself, because we get a very interesting and very sci-fi concept for the main conflict of this little arc. Basically, a being that was a living equation was made and is attacking the Four. Overall, this is a very small arc and doesn't really do much to add to the overall narrative of the story, but again, it's just a great way to look at these characters and how they react to each other, and on top of that, it's just a cool looking antagonist. It's very 2000s and very Y2K, but in the best way possible. We also learn about Reed's relationship with his son Franklin as well as Johnny. And we also see Johnny starting to develop a bit more maturity as Sue basically makes him the Four's chief financial officer. It's some good stuff. Small stuff. This is another arc where again, we focus mostly on Johnny's growth. I didn't really remember how much they actually focused on Johnny's growth in this earlier part of the series, but I'm all here for it because we show that Johnny can be mature. Usually he's portrayed as a bit of a klutz and a bit of a egomaniac at times. Well, not egomaniac, but he's definitely a little bit popularity hungry at times. But it's a pretty solid showing that Johnny can mature. And it also helps that, Mark Waid is just a good writer who knows how to write character arcs. Unthinkable. And this is where we get to what I call the first major arc of this run. And this, of course, involves probably the greatest villain in Marvel Comics, Dr. Doom. And this is Doom at his most evil, his most sadistic. Seriously, I don't know if he's ever been more evil in the history of Marvel. So, full disclosure, Doom is one of my favorite characters in Marvel, period. He's a very interesting, complex character, but can also function as a great villain. But I'm not even going to tell you everything he does in this arc because it's just terrifying. Genuinely, there's points in this run that it just turns into a horror comic, basically. So this is a 5-part arc where we just see how low Doom can get when trying to ruin Reed's life. He knows that there's one specific blind spot that Reed has because he refuses to respectfully acknowledge it, and Reed's blind spot is magic. So, Doom basically goes back into his heritage of being Romani and, having all that magic in his bloodline, and using that to basically torture Reed and traumatize everyone in the Fantastic Four. Why? Because he just can, because he's Doom. I don't even want to spoil much because, again, this is the darkest moment in the series, and I feel like the impact of it somewhat involves just not knowing what's happening going in. And seriously, it's just great stuff. It doesn't even feel like the Four win at the end. I don't think anyone wins. I think they just survive. Fifth Wheel. This arc functions as the epilogue or the cool-off after Unthinkable, and we see how everyone is just responding very poorly after what happened. Franklin is basically suffering from depression due to trauma, barely having any interest in anything and just has the joy crushed out of him. It's rough to see, but it's just so honest that I have to respect it. I've definitely been where Franklin was due to intense anxiety or depressive burnout before. And I won't really read it out here, but Ben gives one of the most honest speeches I've ever read in any sort of fiction. Seriously, I think if you need something to hear when you're suffering from an anxiety moment, I feel like reading that speech will help you during these issues. And again, this arc just really shows that Mark Waid gets these characters. He's allowing them to be emotional, to be vulnerable, which I feel like a lot of lesser writers would not try to do at all. They wouldn't even consider having this be an arc. And Wieringo's art just shows the maturity and, again, the humans under everything. I mean, Ben Grimm's a rock. He's basically a rock guy. You don't have to draw him being emotional and sitting down at a bench and really thinking things out, but they do that anyway, because these are people, and that's the point of the Fantastic Four. But I'm getting a little blubbery and a little bit ahead of myself, so let's talk about the next arc, Authoritative Action. I want to first mention this is the only arc where the art is not done by Wieringo. Instead, it's done by Howard Porter. And while I do think his art is great in many other comics, I don't really like it here. I think it's because his style is so drastically different from Wieringo's that it kind of gives me whiplash. Though this is one of the darker arcs of the series, so I think the art does fit to some extent. And the reason why this arc is so dark is because Reed is still heavily damaged after Doom harmed him and his family. In fact, I would even go to argue that he hasn't really recovered at all. Because Reed, deep down, hates never having a solution. Here, Reed basically goes against the literal UN and tries to take over Latveria and gets himself into some deep political shit. His actions basically end up in a situation where everyone gets harmed. Like, everyone is telling him, Reed, this isn't right. This is a dark moment for you. You need to start thinking clearly. And it kind of ends up with a lot of people getting hurt. Also, major spoilers here. I don't want to spoil this for you because it is very important for the arc, but if you absolutely need to do this, just skip to not this arc, but maybe the arc after it. But Ben Grimm dies hereafter. This was originally meant to be the end of Mark Waid and Mike Wieringo's run on the Four, and man, if this was the ending, I would be so down for it. Though I do think we get so many great stories after the fact. As previously established, Ben Grimm has passed. So, what do? Simple. Reed has found a way to break into heaven, and this is probably one of the most Fantastic Four type of arcs in the best way possible. The Four have always worked best as explorers first, and this arc just gets it. We just have to deal with the strange and ethereal realm of heaven, as well as the test given to them by God and the angels. And it's just super emotional. I'm not gonna spoil anything here, but if you really want an arc that's gonna tug at your heartstrings, you gotta read this arc. I'm not even gonna spoil how it ends outside of Ben Grimm doesn't stay dead for too long. Seriously, if you're gonna read any arcs from this run, read this, Unthinkable, and a later arc that's coming up soon, Spider Sense. So, you probably skipped here after the spoilers and the sections that I've labeled heavy spoilers. So, hi, hello. If you're confused about a couple things I'm going to mention later on, that's because spoilers. You skipped the spoilers. So, yeah, keep that in mind. Spider Sense is sort of built to be a bit of levity after what happened in the previous 4 arcs, because seriously, a lot happened, and I think after that, we need a bit of a chuckle. So, this main story is about Spider-Man, because if you actually know anything about Marvel Comics, you know that Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four are pretty well co-linked in like a lot of history that's happened in early Marvel, but that's because back in the day, Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four were like their 2 most popular comics. But anyways, this mainly focuses on Spider-Man and Johnny Storm. Johnny and Spider-Man kind of have like a bit of a frenemy relationship, but not one that gets outwardly malicious. I won't really say much here, but it's a really funny arc about Johnny trying to get a bit more popularity after stuff that's happened, and it just blowing up in his face. It's pretty funny, I would recommend seeing it. Dysfunctional. Here we have the return of the Frightful Four and the classic Fantastic Four villain, the Wizard. And here we learn one major thing. The Wizard sucks. He's a bad dude. He treats his daughter Cole terribly, and if anything, he's a dark reflection of Reed Richards, doing science for his own selfish end. Hell, this isn't even the last time he's ever essentially abused one of his own children. But yeah, this arc goes from a usual villain of the weak feeling story into something a lot more impactful and a little bit more harsh. Fortitude. This arc is a classic example of a high concept sci-fi story that naturally complements some of the best elements of the Four. The premise being an alien device has landed on Earth and is raising the whole island of Manhattan into the air. We soon learned the goals of this alien and that his goals were essentially to stop a much greater force coming Earth's way. And I do like this arc, but it's pretty much just set up for the arc that's coming after this. So don't get me wrong, it's still fun. But there's not really much going on, it's just straightforward classic pulpy sci-fi. But the next arc is something to really talk about. Rising Storm. Remember how I said that if you absolutely had to read a few arcs in this run, I said to read Unthinkable, Hereafter, and a third one? Well, this is that arc. This arc functions as the true final conflict of Mark Waid and Michael Ringo's time on the Four, and it's a great one to leave out on. And of course, how could they finish up writing for the Four without using one of their greatest foes, Galactus? This arc is just a mastery of the characters. Seriously, if you want any example to show that Mark Waid truly understands what the Fantastic Four is about and what they're trying to say, this is the arc. So a bit of spoilers here. But I really love the final issue of this arc because it mainly focuses on the fact that Galactus is now human. I believe this is more or less Waid showing us to the readers what makes the Four so special and why they're so important from a character that's pretty much diametrically opposed to them and ideologically opposed to them. We see through Galactus' view that this world will always have problems, and it's easy to sort of slip into that numb nihilism that just lets the world slip you by. But that's what makes the Four so special. They understand that they can't solve all of humanity's problems, but they can at least try to make the world better as they go. Because it's not about being the ultimate force of good, but about being empathetic and having that healthy amount of curiosity to learn to understand others. The scene that best exemplifies this is actually when Galactus goes to the Guggenheim Art Museum in New York. And there he sees Alicia's art and just tears into it. Like, seriously, he's really rude about it. And then Sue tells him off because that's Alicia's piece. And Galactus kind of has this moment of, well, if she's blind, why is she doing art? Why is she doing any of this? Why is she sculpting? Why is she doing X, Y, and Z if she can't see? But that's the point. Sure, there's a lot of things we can't do, and humans have limitations. But it's all about doing more and making a better world for everyone after us to see. The accomplishments, pushing the line. It's about progressing the world so the ones after us can have a better chance. And truly, I couldn't have said it any other way. Tag. This is sort of an epilogue arc to the story. Just one more story, because this time the Four don't have their powers. Because there's one final concept the reader needs to be imparted with. The Four are not the Four because of their powers, but it's just because who they are deep down. If anything, their powers just let them chase their goals and wants at a different rate than most other people. And this little epilogue is where we leave Mark Waid and Michael Ringo's time on the Fantastic Four. A family that, despite all the trials, tribulations, magic spells, gods, and enemies, they love and care for each other deeply and fully. And to me, that's what makes their Fantastic Four perfect. So, I think by now you'll completely get why I think this is the best arc. And if you want to read this run, then go check it out. It goes from Fantastic Four 1998, issues 60 to 70, to Fantastic Four 1961, issues 500 to 524. Yes, the numbering is a little bit weird because they went back to a new number one back in the day, and then they went back to the original numbering order. It's not too confusing when you realize that's what it is. But if you want some ways to read it, you can buy the omnibus and the volumes, or try out Marvel Unlimited. Though if you want a free way to read it, might I recommend an ad blocker? But don't tell anyone I said that, okay? They might come after me. Seriously, if you felt reserved or felt like you don't click with the Fantastic Four, then I heavily recommend reading this run of the comics. It definitely got me interested. So, with all that out of the way, do you agree with me? Do you not? Let me know in the comments below. And please, like, comment, subscribe. Seriously, it really helps. But with all that being said, I'll see you next time.